And it'll actually be worse than California. The reason it'll be worse than California is because the one thing that keeps California from being super crazy is that you can move out of California, like you and I did. You and I used to be in California, but we moved to Texas. We're still in America. But if the Dems win this election, they will legalize enough illegals to turn the swing states, and everywhere will be like California. There will be no escape.
From the sun-drenched beaches to the tech hubs of Silicon Valley, California has long been the epitome of prosperity and innovation. But what if beneath this glittering facade, cracks are forming, threatening the very foundation of the Golden State? Socially, California's fabric is fraying. Homelessness has reached crisis levels, with over 160,000 people living on the streets. Public safety is also a growing concern, with crime rates rising in major cities. These issues are symptoms of deeper societal divides and devastating social reforms. Like, here's a fact. California has seen a rise in child soldiers over the past 10 years. Seriously. Children as young as 10 being recruited by gangs to commit armed robbery, hijackings, and more. Here's another fact. There are an estimated 44,000 people living, eating, and defecating on the streets of LA. They have brought rats and medieval diseases including typhus, and some experts fear the return of cholera and leprosy. So, how the hell did this happen? Well, there was an important Supreme Court case in 2011 called Brown versus Plata. And in this decision, it was determined that the California state prison system was in violation of the Eighth Amendment, which is cruel and unusual punishment. And this was owing to the fact that prisons were operating at 200% capacity at that time. Some justices dissented, arguing that releasing prisoners posed public safety risks and that the order was beyond the court's authority. Anyway, according to this ruling, California had to conform to a very arbitrary capacity ratio, 137.5%. So, okay, if you were at the 137.5%, you were no longer in violation of the Eighth Amendment, or whatever. So, as a result of this ruling, California did have to find ways to comply and took a number of steps to do so, such as dumping criminals into local jails. Great. Coinciding with this ruling is the emergence of the criminal justice reform movement, principally coming out of places like Stanford Law School. This led to AB 109, or the Public Safety Act. And the idea was to reduce the number of prisoners in the state system. You would transfer so-called non-violent, non-sexual, low-risk offenders to county jails. There's a problem, though. And the problem was the issue of what classified non-violent, non-sexual, low-risk offenders. Because under AB 109, the only offense that would be considered was the last offense for which you were convicted. So, in other words, inmates with long and violent criminal histories who happened to be in jail in state prison because of a non-violent offense were eligible for this system, and they were transferred out. 27,000 of them. The next year, property crimes went up 9%. Also, non-violent is defined as anything that is not one of 23 specific crimes listed in the obscure section of the Penal Code. So, non-violent could be the drug trafficking, human trafficking, or some forms of assault. Anyway, offenders under this provision would have opportunities for parole. Turns out this was a bad idea. There's a case of an offender released under this bill who went on to kill 5 people. See, the parole system is completely incompetent at the local levels. They do not have the resources to enforce consistent supervision. And there was a participation rate of offenders of only 9% in California. And even with all these changes, California still didn't meet the capacity threshold of 137.5%. Moreover, 61% of those offenders who were eligible for this program were arrested within a year. Soon after this series of disasters, the criminal reform movement proposed yet another bill, and this was called Proposition 47. It was called, euphemistically, the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act. And the idea behind it was that California would again address the mass incarceration problem, reduce the prison capacity by shifting, again, nonviolent offenders, and treating thefts under $950 as misdemeanors. Prior to this law, thefts at $400 would be felony grand larceny. Another factor of Prop 47 was that drug possessions, which would no longer be considered a felony, which exacerbated the drug and homeless problem. The law has been criticized for not effectively dealing with repeat offenders. Since the charges for certain offenses were reduced, some individuals with multiple offenses continue to commit crimes, knowing the legal consequences are relatively minor. With many offenses now classified as misdemeanors, local jails can be overcrowded with misdemeanor offenders, straining resources. This shift also means less time spent on investigating and prosecuting more serious crimes. Retailers have reported significant increases in theft, leading to higher security costs, changes in store layout like locking up products, or even closures in some areas. This affects local economies and can lead to business flight from areas with high theft rates. Also, reclassified offenders would no longer be subject to mandatory and standard DNA testing. As a result, testing across the state went from 15,000 tests a month to merely 5,000 a month. And you have to understand, DNA testing is critical for the solving of cold case homicides and other violent crimes that, are typically associated with people with track records, because criminality is comorbid. In other words, a small number of people commit the overwhelming majority of crime. New York City, for example, was heavily criticized for enforcing the jumping of turnstiles, a non-violent crime. The problem, however, is that 20% of turnstile jumpers happen to have an open arrest warrant, often for serious, sometimes quite heinous crimes. Police work has always worked this way. Cops use small crimes to catch big crimes, like how a hunter picks up a scent. And it's why decriminalization has had so many destructive second-order effects. But the activists weren't done there. Next was the Racial Justice Act of 2020, which allows defendants to challenge their convictions based on the presence of bias or racial animus by, let's say, anyone involved in the trial. It doesn't have to have any bearing on whether or not the evidence supports their guilt at all. These can be guilty people, cases where evidence proved beyond a doubt. But if there was a white racist involved, at any level, they can get their convictions thrown out under the Racial Justice Act. And this happened in the city of Antioch. It's called the Antioch texting scandal, in which 4 young gang members were on trial for attempted murder. There were gang enhancements applied to them, which would mean that they were going to face a lot more jail time. But at the same time, it came out that the police officers in Antioch were texting racist messages to each other in private, not as part of the job, not relating to even their involvement in the case, but just in personal conversations. And when this came out, the judge presiding over the case utilized the Racial Justice Act and threw out all the gang enhancements against the gang members. Incredible. Defense attorneys can also use statistical evidence of bias. Any nebulous statistical evidence of racial disparity can satisfy a burden of proof that there is racial injustice. So, for instance, if a jurisdiction is applying gang enhancements in greater proportion to Amish gang members, for example, under the Racial Justice Act, these statistical differences can be entered into consideration by the judge, and whether or not to apply any sentencing to these filthy Amish animals. And it gets worse. The same year, Sacramento passed AB 3076, which took away the ability of prosecutors to apply peremptory challenges to prospective jurors on the basis of bias. So, for instance, up until AB 3070, if a juror would say something like, "My son had been arrested," or "I have a negative opinion of police," and this would be a cause by which a prosecutor could use a peremptory challenge to remove the juror. Well, under AB 3070, if this juror is a member of a protected group, prosecutors can no longer use peremptory challenges against them, even if they say, "I hate cops," because they're a protected group. So the result of this is, as one of the top prosecutors in the entire state said, is the proliferation of OJ juries. In other words, juries who explicitly allow criminals to go free due to personal, political, and frankly tribal reasons. So, while we're on the subject, let's talk crime. I've got some inconvenient hate facts for you. Less than 1% of New York's population were responsible for 33% of the shoplifting arrests in the city. This isn't unprecedented by any means. Sentencing 11 people was enough to drop one British town's bike thefts by about 90%. In another case, the number of burglaries in Leinster plummeted after 3 men died in a car crash. And here's where it gets really interesting. There's actually no proven link between poverty and crime, like at all. First off, most poor people don't commit crime. Second, you have to make a distinction between causation and correlation. Like, it's not unlikely that the sort of antisocial traits that would lead someone down a life of crime would also correlate with poverty or a lack of success. It's a chicken and egg situation. In New York, from 1990 to 2017, poverty slightly increased, yet crime declined drastically. Specifically, a 90% decline in homicides. More often, violent crime is caused by notions of perceived disrespect and clashes over status or reputation. You can even track these instances based on social media posts made by gangs disrespecting each other. Of other factors, inequality, unemployment, etc., none reliably scale with crime. In the Great Depression, homicides dropped by 50%, and you'll find similar numbers for the 2008 Great Recession. Here's another interesting fact. One study found that crime decreases by 25% for high-risk individuals after their girlfriend becomes pregnant, and stays that way after the baby is born. Weird, considering kids cost a lot of money. The other issue we have to address is the great white whale that is social programs. This idea is really at the root of many of California's problems. However, Chicago quite often sees massive increases in social spending, schools, community centers, drugs programs, yet crime still increases. The best way to think of California is like Saudi Arabia. It's a bizarre, highly religious society whose quirks are financed by a handful of lucrative industries. Most people don't think of California as religious, but in fact, California is the global leader in cults. The infamous Jim Jones People's Temple, before they moved to the jungle and took their own lives, started in San Francisco. And this ties back to the Satanism of MS-13. Remember, it started in California and spread to Mexico later. It's satanic California cult and the result of the absolute darkest aspects of the American melting pot. The vast majority of people incarcerated are not incarcerated primarily for drugs. And even the ones that are incarcerated primarily for drugs are incarcerated because they've also proven themselves to be dangerous. In other words, these are the individuals who have very, very lengthy criminal histories. The average criminal in the United States had more than 10 prior arrests and more than 5 prior convictions before they entered prison. If you look at the recidivism data, in the United States, more than 3/4 of people who were incarcerated, primarily for drug offenses, are going to get rearrested for a non-drug offense after they're released. More than 1/3 of them will be rearrested for at least one violent offense. In short, no one's really going to prison on their first offense. On average, only 40% of state felony convictions result in a post-conviction prison sentence, and most people entering the prison have at least one prior felony convictions, multiple misdemeanor convictions, and more than multiple arrests. The median amount of time actually served in state prison is about 16 months. The mean is a little over 2 years. To summarize, even before the lunacy of California crime laws, America has always been extremely lenient on criminals. Now, let's back up a little bit. Because before the crime wave started, Southern gangs were already making their way into California. Around 2010, there was a hostile takeover of the narcotics distribution market in California, which had been otherwise the domain of black gangs, native-born black Americans. For example, Compton was the largest black population west of the Mississippi since the Second World War. Today, it's almost entirely Spanish-speaking. Moving from about 74% black in the 1970s, the city's population has shifted to being nearly 70% Latino, according to recent observations. The Mexican Mafia, a powerful prison gang, has been noted to influence street gangs to engage in violent activities against African Americans in various neighborhoods, including Compton. This has included direct intimidation, violence, and threats aimed at driving black families out of certain areas. Black Americans in California have, over the past decade, experienced the single largest ethnic cleansing in modern American history. It was systematic and extremely lethal, and no one talks about it. Hell, most people aren't even aware of it. As a result of this, gangs ran by black Americans had to then find an alternative revenue stream. And what was the safest alternative? Residential burglaries and retail theft. So, all of the retail theft we see today, that's not just like incidental and individual acts of larceny. That is all organized by gangs for resale, often enlisting children or the homeless as frontline soldiers.
This and this.
What's that for?
I got bullet shots. Bullet shots.
Got shot.
Got shot 3 times. He got shot too. Got shot.
What is that?
He got shot.
They opened it to
They
check.
opened it just like him. Just like him. He got shot like 2 months, like a month ago.
What gang?
This one, the one they got in the back, on 15.
14.
15.
By the way, fencing stolen goods in California is a $10 billion industry. Nationwide retail thefts cost around $100 billion. But what's quite interesting is that there are some gangs that have become so good at it that they now actually act as consultants to other gangs to teach them how to execute various strategies for burglary and retail theft. It's a bull market. Speaking of bull market, this video is brought to you by Keyed Energy. Keyed is unique because it treats fatigue and stress from work, social situations, and more by using glycine and other supplements that aren't available anywhere else. Yeah, Keyed is the only drink anywhere with glycine. It's also the only drink with non-mold derived citric acid. KeyedEnergy.com, check it out. Anyway, the black gangs were powerless to stop this takeover from southern gangs, due to both the organization and overwhelming numbers of their opponent. In LA County, 195,000 students are English learners. There's 90 languages officially spoken in the LA school district alone. 27% of California is foreign-born, and that number is steadily increasing. In fact, the 27% doesn't even include second-generation immigrants, which would bring the amount closer to 50%. Here's another factor. California, in 2012, under the auspices of so-called budget cutting, eliminated a 100-year-old agency called the Bureau of Narcotic Enforcement, which was widely held amongst law enforcement officers as a very important task force for fighting organized crime, and had been doing so since Prohibition, and then became a major force in disrupting narcotics trade in the state. But it gets worse. Right now, as we speak, there are illegal aliens being recruited into the LAPD. In 2022, California passed laws allowing non-U.S. citizens, including DACA recipients, to join law enforcement agencies. The LAPD, in response, has been working on policy adjustments to accommodate these new officers. Specifically, there's an initiative to allow DACA officers to carry department-issued firearms even when off-duty, addressing the federal restrictions that generally prohibit DACA recipients from personally owning firearms. Again, these people are not legally allowed to carry firearms, but the state allows them to be armed while on duty. It's shocking. In February of 2023, an off-duty LAPD detective encountered 2 members of the Serrano Gang, which is a very violent, powerful Latino gang in Southern California. They were attempting to rob someone's car. There was an exchange of gunfire, and the gangsters got away. And in their getaway car, in which they were apprehended the next day, it turns out that the car was registered to an illegal immigrant in the LAPD. There's a historical precedent for this, by the way. During the American Civil War, the Northern Army was largely staffed by immigrants. Just, something to think about. The gangs are also satanic. No, I'm not being figurative. They are very open about this. They didn't actually start as a satanic organization, though. See, MS-13 started in Los Angeles because the Salvadorans weren't allowed to sell drugs by the Mexican gangs, so they created a group that was called the 18th Street Gang. These groups started in fighting, and eventually they created MS-13. During this time, the gang started to mix occult practices from both North and South America, and it became extremely popular among gang members and actually spread from America back down into Mexico. Originally formed in Los Angeles in the 1980s by Salvadoran immigrants, MS-13 has been noted for some of its members' involvement with satanic imagery and practices. According to ethnographic accounts like Gangsters Without Borders, some early members were hardcore Satanists who practiced animal sacrifices, which contributed to the gang's reputation for evil and terror. One former gang member explained his experience with this group, Quote, "I was used to killing of people, but I killed for territory. I killed to collect money. I killed for extortion. But one time, I came to this house and they were about to kill a baby. And I said, oh wait, what are we doing? Why are we gonna kill that baby? And they told them because the beast asked for a baby, so we have to give him a baby," end quote. In other words, this stone-cold killer, this lifelong hitman, quit the gang because he couldn't tolerate the human sacrifice. There was also a case in Houston where MS-13 members allegedly killed a girl in what was described as a satanic ritual. Now, if you aren't black-pilled yet, let's move on to the next issue, homelessness.
Where are you from?
Louisiana, Texas area.
How long you been in San Francisco?
Since June. If you're gonna be homeless, it's pretty fucking easy here. I mean, if we're gonna be realistic, they pay you to be homeless here.
When you said that San Francisco pays people to be homeless, what did you mean by that? Did you mean that literally?
Yeah. I mean, I get $620 a month, dude.
From
Cash
general
money.
assistance,
Yeah.
or how was that hard to get?
Fucking phone call, bro. A
Wow.
fucking phone call. 200 food stamps and $620 cash a month.
Wow.
Forget about it. Why wouldn't I do it? You know, it's fucking free money, dude. This right now is literally by choice. Literally by choice. Like, why would I want to pay rent? I'm not doing shit. I got a fucking cell phone that I have Amazon Prime and Netflix on. We used to battle with the cops. Now, it's like the cops are... It's like they're your neighbor, you know? And then went on, these two kids came up and they're like, hey, do you guys know where to get any Oxycontin? They're like, I'm 15 and I'm 16, you know? Like, I'm an old school junkie, you know? And I'm like, well, look, dude, I'm gonna tell you right now, like, you're not gonna get Oxycontin out here on the street. I was like, how much money are you trying to spend? And they were like, we got $40. And I said, okay, this is what I'm gonna do. I am going to take your money, and I went and I got a fentanyl. And I fucking brought it back and I set it down in front of them and I said, this is a gram of fentanyl. This is enough to kill 6 people that have never used it. What I do to get high is this much, and I showed them how much I do. I was like, I'm keeping your money, and now I'm gonna teach you how to save each other's lives, because you're not gonna fucking stop. I can't steer you away from doing it, but the best thing I could do for you now is give you real drugs and show you how to do it properly and show you how to save your friend's life. And I showed them how to pull up Narcan and how to inject each other with the Narcan needle in case they died. I needed the money, let's be honest.
Across from the Google office in Venice is a shanty town. Hundreds of tents right next to Google. It's a fascinating dichotomy. Local gangs extract tribute from each homeless tent every single day, $20 to $50 a day. And this is happening across the city. There's 75,000 homeless in Los Angeles. And if they cannot meet the tribute, they are forced to sell drugs or other crimes. And by the way, thanks to California law, cops are required to get the search warrants to enter any tents. The tents have become dens of the most depraved aspects of the drug trade. And it's right next to Google. An estimated 181,000 people in California were experiencing homelessness in January 2023, which represents about 28% of the nation's entire homeless population. A significant majority, about 68%, are unsheltered, meaning they live outside in tents, cars, or other makeshift shelters. A substantial portion of the homeless population deals with mental health issues or substance abuse. Approximately 25% of homeless adults in Los Angeles County, for example, suffer from severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia, and 27% have a long-term substance abuse disorder. The Housing First policy, which focuses on providing housing without prerequisites like sobriety or treatment compliance, has been criticized for not adequately addressing these underlying issues. Attacking mental institutions had become hugely popular. In 2 influential 1961 books, a psychiatrist argued that mental illnesses didn't exist, and that the institutions themselves created mental illness. 1 year later, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a novel about a sane but socially maladjusted man who was drugged, electroshocked, and lobotomized by a mental institution, became a bestseller. Over the next 2 decades, state mental hospitals would empty out, but the vast majority of released patients ended up homeless on the street. Congress had encouraged the closing of state mental hospitals without any realistic plan regarding what would happen to the discharged patients, especially those who refused to take medication they needed to remain well. For decades, many progressives have claimed that homelessness is really just a kind of poverty, a manifestation of social inequality. Today, many of California's leading homelessness advocates insist that the current crisis is due mostly to the housing shortage. Homelessness experts and advocates disagree. Quote, "I've rarely seen a normal, able-bodied, able-minded, non-drug-using homeless person who's just down on their luck," LA street doctor Susan Partovi said. "Of the thousands of people I've worked with over 16 years, it's like 1 or 2 people a year, and they're the easiest to deal with. 100% of the people on the streets are mentally impacted, on drugs or both," she said. The people who work directly with the homeless say things worsened after California abandoned the carrot and stick approach toward treating the severely mentally ill and drug addicts who are repeat offenders. "The ACLU will come after me if I say the mentally ill need to be taken off the street," said Dr. Partovi. "So let me be clear that they need to be taken care of, too." She says things worsened 10 years ago when LA and other California cities rejected drug recovery as a condition of housing. When the Housing First with a Harm Reduction model came in, they said, "Recovery doesn't work," said Partovi. But it was after that when homelessness exploded exponentially. And it's happening on an unprecedented scale. California has seen its homeless population skyrocket over the past decade, while the national average has declined by 10%. California, despite making up 12% of the US population, is responsible for 50% of America's homeless. And this distinction between unsheltered and unhoused is extremely important. It's at the root of California's decay. Basically, we used to treat homelessness with a shelter first, or linear staircase model. The idea being that a homeless addict with mental illnesses might not quite be ready to get a lease on a one-bedroom apartment, so naturally you provide steps in between the two. A spectrum where you slowly build your life back together, starting from living on the streets, then moving into bare-bones temporary housing with some treatment facilities, then moving to a slightly more advanced facility, maybe with a therapist, and then finally, after you've fixed the root problems of your unsustainable lifestyle, you are then moved into permanent housing. In the early 2000s, this model was changed to Housing First. Surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, this method was started during the Bush administration and later popularized and expanded by Obama. It was then turned into federal law, requiring states to follow a Housing First model if they wanted federal funding. California quickly jumped on board and announced a 10-year plan to shift the state's entire homeless initiative to Housing First. It wasn't a controversial decision either. Actually, it was universally praised by the field's experts and backed up by countless peer-reviewed studies. Tell me you trusted the experts without telling me you trusted the experts. Anyway, here's the deal. Housing First doesn't work for most people, and it's unbelievably expensive. HUD-approved housing in California takes around 3 to 6 years to complete, with some units taking more than a decade. The units, which are basically one-bedroom apartments, cost around $300,000 to $600,000, along with some extreme cases that cost millions. I really can't overstate how difficult it is to build in California. France's National Railway Company pulled out of bidding for the high-speed rail contract in California in 2011. They said the state was awful to work in, and they preferred to work somewhere less dysfunctional. So, they went to Africa. I'm not joking. Californians have passed decades of half-baked regulations, making it effortless for anyone to shut down a building project. Any anonymous individual can file a frivolous CEQA complaint and get construction shut down under the guise of environmental safety. And even if you somehow manage to raise millions and get your building projects finished, the homeless are now protected under the Fair Housing Act. Because, again, they're in a house now, not a shelter. This means you can't evict them without jumping through dozens of arbitrary hoops. Texas, on the other hand, found a way around the Housing First problem, and their homeless rate plummeted. The state is wildly deregulated and doesn't rely on federal funding. They can set up community shelters because there aren't a mountain of zoning laws stopping them. And again, these are shelters, not housing. Bare bones amenities with no plumbing and a shared kitchen. It's not pretty to look at, sure, but it gets people off the streets and puts them on the right path. Oh, and by the way, the units in Texas only cost around $80K. Incredible. This problem is an open secret amongst Californians. Everyone knows how to solve it, but everyone's afraid to tell the truth. When mayors try to enforce camping bans, they come under attack from radical left activists posing as advocates for the homeless. The activists protest the mayors at their homes and try to stop police from shutting down the open drug scenes, misdescribed as homeless encampments. Many of those activists have a financial interest in keeping people on the street. They make money offering services, shelter, and housing. The reason that Governor Dick Newsom and progressive mayors in San Diego, San Francisco, Oakland, Sacramento, and other cities don't shut down the open drug scenes where children are being redacted is because they are afraid to cross the ACLU and the radical left. It's not just that they are scared of being protested at their homes. Newsom and the progressive mayors depend on the ACLU, Soros, and other progressive interest groups and donors to finance their campaigns. It's a convenient cycle, really. They let these problems build up, and then vote for more programs and federal aid to solve the problems they created. And then the programs and federal aid is used to line their pockets. Then they let crime build back up, and the cycle starts over. Just look at Africa. Foreign aid always ends up being a jobs program. Always. Cali reversed course on crime recently, in fact. Every county in the state voted to repeal Prop 48, one of the only propositions ever to be passed unanimously. Even Canada has started to hit the brakes, recently announcing that mass immigration has exploded the cost of housing and rolling out a plan to cut back on the amount of foreign migrants. But again, it's a cycle. Some time will pass. Everyone will forget, and it'll all start back up again. Time is a flat circle. One can easily make a comparison of the late Roman Empire, the period between 376 AD and 476 AD, and what we're experiencing now in California. In that period, it is the erosion of borders. There was the influxes of migrants, about 2 million from Germanic and Huns, into Rome, not assimilated. The Roman frontier system, particularly in the Rhine and Danube regions, became porous. The arrival of groups like the Visigoths, who were initially allowed to settle within the empire's borders, eventually led to significant internal disruption. Breakdown of law at the county levels, a disconnect from the capital, and a lot of those immigrants in Rome went into law enforcement, one of the legions. The Roman military increasingly relied on barbarian mercenaries due to a shortage of Roman recruits. While these forces were necessary for defense, their loyalty was not always secure, leading to internal conflicts and coups. There was a Roman term called luxus, and it was this notion that the elite at that time were embracing decadence, cult religions. In modern terms, trends, or any sort of values that were antithetical to the values that built the Republic. The Romans also had a debasement of the currency, reducing the silver content in coins, which caused rampant inflation and a decrease in the value of money, which eroded the economic stability of the empire. The decline was not sudden, but involved a myriad of interconnected factors that eroded the empire's ability to govern effectively and defend its borders. It all sounds kind of familiar, and if this stresses you out, remember, they want to make everywhere like California. Also, shout out to Chris Moritz. He's where I got much of the data in this video. He has a new book on California coming out soon. Check him out. On that note, don't forget to like and subscribe, and forcefully immigrate into my comments section. Really take it over, like you mean it. Also check out Keyed Energy. Take care.
I think it's a lot of the style that was in like BioShock. Yeah. And people like to believe, like Redditor atheist types like to, that's an attractive world, that BioShock world, because it's like, look at this greatness that could have been, but it was all twisted and perverted because we're humans and we're all ugly inside, and capitalism. And that's why Art Deco is like a backdrop for failed greatness, failed empire. And what people are uncomfortable looking at is like cities like Detroit, and just the greatness of empire that was ruined by you know what, and we know what, and it has nothing to do with capitalism or or ugliness living inside people or anything like that. It's greatness that we could easily that we did attain, and we could easily attain if we had the political means and the willpower and whatever, its greatness that we will attain again